whether we use state-based persistence or event sourcing, there's going to come a time when we're building our system where we will have to evolve our model. We may have some new domain insight that requires us to add something. We may just want to add a new feature. But whatever the case is, we're going to have to evolve the data model that we've been using up to this point. With state-based persistence techniques, this isn't too bad. We may have to add a new column, for example, or a new table. We may have to provide some default values. It gets more complicated, though, when we do event sourcing. So we're going to dive into why it's more complicated. Now, the first thing that we have to recognize is that event source solutions are only as good as the log. That log is absolutely critical, because if we mess up the log, if we cause a problem in the log, we can't use it anymore to rebuild the state. So it's very, very important that we maintain the integrity of the log. We should think of the log as facts. Those events are basically facts. They are things that happened in the system. They represent history. And of course, just like in real life, we should never rewrite history. We don't want to cause grandfather paradoxes and things like that. So we don't want to rewrite history. Therefore, the events must be immutable. What that means is that your log is essentially append only. You never update, you never delete. Once you write something to the log, it is there in that condition for all time. This guarantees the integrity of the log. We can say that at this point in time, this is exactly what happened, nothing else. If we go back and start changing the log in any way, then we can't say anymore what happened at that point of time, because we may have changed it. So it's very, very important that we maintain that event integrity so that we don't cause situations where we can't guarantee the quality of our log anymore. But this does present a problem. And the problem that it presents is that over time, events may need to change. We may need to add new fields to the events. We may need to remove fields. We may need to rename things. Over time, we have to change things because we realize that there are better ways to represent something in the database. But the events are immutable. We can't go back and change them. This means that we have to create a versioning scheme for the events. So we have to have something like, if our original event was reservation moved, we have to have something like a reservation moved version 1, reservation moved version 2, reservation moved version 3. So every time we have to make a change to the event, we don't go back and modify the existing events. Instead, we introduce a new version. What that does is it allows us to guarantee the integrity of the log. We can guarantee that our log remains append only, but it allows us to update the events with new fields, renamed fields, removed fields, those kinds of things. So it allows us to make updates. Now, it does, of course, create some issues as well, which means, for example, we have to maintain support for all of those old versions. So we have to continue to be able to parse those old versions into the software. We have to be able to continue to read them. And so we have this old version support that has to stay around for a long period of time, theoretically forever. So it creates issues in that respect as well. An important thing to realize then, and a best practice that we should remember, is to use a format for the log that is flexible. There are certain types of formats that are very flexible, and there are other types that are inflexible. For example, if you look at a type like protobuf, protobuf is extremely flexible. You can rename fields without having to change the actual format. You can do other things. You can add fields. Potentially, you can remove fields in some cases. So it's very flexible in that sense. JSON is also very flexible. You can reorder fields in JSON. You can't rename them easily, but you can add new fields, remove fields, things like that. So JSON is a fairly flexible format as well. Java serialization is extremely inflexible. So with Java serialization, any change you make is probably going to break your serialization. So we want to use flexible formats, protobuf, JSON. There's others, so those are a couple of examples. But make sure that you use a flexible format. Now, in the Lightbend ecosystem, when we want to version events, we can do that using what we call akka event adapters. So event adapters, it's just a small piece of code that takes the database representation of the event and translates it into a domain representation of the event. And so what that allows us to do is in the database, we can have a reservation moved version 1, version 2, version 3, but in the domain, maybe we only deal with reservation moved version 1, or rather just reservation moved. The event adapter then has the responsibility of figuring out how to translate from those database representations into the single domain representation. And so that can include things like adding default values for a field, for example. So we can use event adapters here to translate between the events.